We are live in council chamber.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to call this meeting to order. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional land of Treaty 6 territory and acknowledge the diverse indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked this territory for centuries, such as Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Nkotasu, as well as Métis and Inuit, and all settlers from around the world. I will do a roll call of committee members. Councillor Stevenson,
Good morning.
Councillor Knack,
Good morning.
Councillor Rice,
Good morning.
Councillor Rutherford,
Good morning.
and I will run through the rest of council members as well. I think there are a number of council members joining. Councillor Wright,
Good morning.
Councillor Principe,
Good morning.
Councillor Paquette,
Morning.
Councillor Tang,
Good morning.
Councillor Hamilton,
Good morning.
Councillor Salvador,
Good morning.
Councillor Cartmel is here,
Good morning.
and Councillor Jans is here.
Good morning.
Good. All right, adoption of the agenda. Councillor Rutherford,
Yep, I move the adoption of the agenda for May 18th, 2022, executive meeting with the following changes. The addition of 6.1, Edmonton Police Service Funding Formula Policy, C604, further analysis.
okay. Any questions on the adoption of the agenda?
Oh, sorry, and replacement report 5.1.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Request for reschedule.
Yeah, thank you. Any questions on the adoption of the agenda? Seeing none, please vote.
I'm a yes, Madam Clerk.
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Rice, you want to, please, display the votes, please.
We have all the votes.
That's carried. Councillor Rice, you want to move the adoption of the minutes, approval of the minutes?
Sure. So I move adoption for the minutes. I don't know words. I don't have word on my screen. And from last
Yeah, April 27th.
April 27,
Yeah.
and be approved.
Good. Any questions on the approval of the minutes? Seeing none, please vote.
I'm a yes. Sorry, it's not popping up for me. We have all the votes.
Thank you, Councillor Stevenson. Please display the votes. That is carried. Any protocol items? Any protocol? Seeing none. And select items for debate. Councillor Stevenson, you want to go first?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will select items 6.1 and 6.2
6.1, 6.2,
and 9.1.
and 9.1. Councillor Rice?
I think last item is 6.3.
6.3.
Yeah, I would like to support 6.1, but already
Yeah, got
selected.
it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, can someone move that, Councillor Stevenson, you want to move that we vote on the reports not selected for debate?
I don't believe there are. Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
I will move request to reschedule reports, item 5.1 and 5.2.
Thank you. Any questions? Please vote.
We have all the votes.
Display the votes, please. That is carried. Madam Clerk, can you read back what we have already approved?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have approved the following. 5.1, support for small businesses outside of business improvement areas, revised due date June 29th, 2022. And 5.2, goods and services procurement policy, revised due date June 29th, 2022.
Thank you. And the request to speak, I gave an updated list to Councillor Rutherford. Councillor Rutherford, would you like to move that we hear from members of the public?
Yes, I move that we hear from the following speakers and panels when appropriate on item 6.1, Edmonton Police Funding Formula, Policy C604, Further analysis, Wayne Gabois in person. Great. Haroon Ali in person. Alex Hyrick, remote. Pamela Brown, remote. Rob Houle, remote. And Shalini Singha, remote. And then for item 6.3, bylaw 20084 to designate Hangar 11 as a municipal historic resource. We hear from Tim Antoniak, remote, and Dean Wolf, remote, and those are to answer questions only.
Okay. Any questions on hearing from the members of the public? Seeing none, please vote.
We have all the votes.
Display the votes, please. That is carried. And we don't have any request for specific time on the agenda, Madam Clerk?
No, that's right, other than what's already in the
Already,
agenda.
already approved, yep. Thank you. Any councillor inquiries? Seeing none. Report to be dealt with a different time, none. Request to reschedule reports, replacement page already approved. And, all right, we go into our first item, which is 6.1, Madam Clerk.
That's right.
Right, okay. Before we go into a presentation, I just want to say a few words that we're going to have some tough conversation today, and I am very hopeful that our conversation will be very productive, and that we will remain focused on the item on the agenda, which is the funding formula for police, and any other question related to the overall budget, how police is funded. I hope we remain focused on that, and focus on getting the answers that we need. So with that, I will pass it on to our administration for a presentation.
Good morning. We're here today to discuss further analysis of the Edmonton Police Service funding formula policy. With me today is Harm Rai, Branch Manager of Financial Services. In the past several years, police funding has been a topic that many municipalities have been addressing, and the City of Edmonton has been having these conversations in the context of the larger community safety and well-being framework discussions that you heard earlier this week. The report presented today is in response to two motions. Next slide, please. The July 6, 2020 motion suspended Edmonton Police Service funding formula and asked for the formula to be reviewed and reframed as a community safety and well-being funding policy. At the April 6, 2020 council meeting, a motion requested further analysis be completed in revising the formula, including peer funding level comparators and performance accountability mechanisms. We'll also start today's presentation by providing some context, including a brief history of how we got to this point today, an overview of the suspended formula, as well as the roles and responsibilities of City Council, the Edmonton Police Commission, and the Edmonton Police Service, and a summary of the current funding allocations to EPS in the 2019 to 2022 operating budget cycle. Council will need to make two critical decisions related to police funding: the amount of base funding allocated to EPS and the mechanism or process to adjust this base funding on an annual basis. This report and presentation focuses on options and administration's recommendation on the mechanism to allocate budget and provide EPS funding on an annual basis. Administration is not providing a recommendation on the amount of funding to be allocated to EPS starting in 2023. This is a decision that will need to be made by City Council in discussions with the Edmonton Police Commission. Next slide, please. In order to make informed decisions related to EPS funding policies, it's important to understand how we got here. The method used to determine the operating budget for EPS has varied over the years. Prior to the 2016 to 2018 budget cycle, the EPS operating budget was determined as part of the city's budget process in a manner consistent with all other civic departments. Requests for increases to the annual EPS budget were approved by City Council and submitted as part of the proposed budget, and growth to the budget was generally done through service packages. The city set aside a portion of the municipal budget to cover the impact of collective bargaining settlements and later allocated to EPS that funding when labor contracts were finalized. During the deliberation of the 2016 to 2018 operating budget, Council approved a funding formula to determine how much EPS would receive over the 2016 to 2018 cycle. The intention of a funding formula was to constrain growth in line with population plus inflation while providing funding certainty to allow for long-term budgeting and workforce planning. Use of the methodology over the 2016 to 2018 budget identified aspects of the formula that could be improved, including the need for a policy to outline how the formula was intended to work, details regarding the calculation and the application of the formula, and clarity on what is and is not covered by the formula. Uncertainty with respect to the funding formula was identified in the April 12, 2017 Office of the City Auditor report on Edmonton Police Service Staffing Audit. That audit found that while the funding formula was defined, its future application was not clearly established and documented. As a result, in June 2018, City Council approved the Edmonton Police Service Funding Formula Policy, C604, to replace the original 2016 to 2018 funding formula. At the same time, Council approved the Edmonton Police Service Reserve. The EPS funding formula policy was guided by the following principles: to provide a sustainable budget allocation based on predictable indicators that best reflect police cost inflation and changes in demand, to provide funding certainty to better allow for long-term budgeting and workforce planning, to ensure that the formula was simple, transparent, and consistent with the approach used by civic departments, and to provide a review, assessment, and refinement opportunity to the formula prior to the start of each new operating budget cycle. The policy provided a degree of certainty with fixed amount each year within the budget cycle. Under the funding model, EPS was responsible for managing salary settlements, general operational growth, one-time special event funding, all within the approved operating budget. The formula was not intended to cover capital funding for new buildings, significant changes in legislation, or significant growth of the city through annexation. The policy also stated City Council expected EPS would contribute to any citywide cost reduction strategies. The reserve policy permitted Edmonton Police Service to retain and manage operational surpluses and deficits. The combination of both of these policies meant that EPS could retain budget surpluses, but was also responsible for any deficits. Council passed a multi-part motion on July 6, 2020, part of which created the Community Safety and Wellbeing Task Force. At the July 6, 2020 meeting, Council also directed administration to reduce EPS operating budget by $11 million over 2021 and 2022 and suspend the police service funding formula policy, pending a review and reframing as an Edmonton Community Safety and Wellbeing policy. On April 6, 2021, the task force shared its findings with Council through its Safer for All report. Also at that April 6, 2021 meeting, City Council requested a further analysis be completed in revising the formula, including peer funding level comparators and performance accountability mechanisms. I want to take a moment here to discuss the recommendations from the task force report and how they have been or have not been addressed in our report. Recommendation 14.1 in the task force report suggested a freeze to the current level of funding for EPS until alignment with comparable cities is achieved. While this report makes no recommendation on the level of funding for EPS, funding in 2022 is essentially frozen at 2021 levels, with only an increase of $1 million between 2021 and 2022. Administration completed a jurisdictional scan and undertook discussions with several other Canadian municipalities related to police funding models. Administration has not provided the detailed analysis in this report. We understand the desire for a comparison of funding per capita, but in undertaking the work, it became clear that the analysis of per capita funding is a complex exercise that requires not just a review of financial data, but an understanding of the local environment in which police operate and the structure of the municipal organizations and budgets in order to be able to draw appropriate conclusions. The roles and responsibilities, scope and level of services, funding sources for police departments vary across Canada. Consideration must also be given to the socioeconomic factors in each municipality, things like cost of living and other factors such as geographic location, all which can have an effect on the response required from policing organizations. All of these factors make it difficult for us to draw reliable conclusions when just comparing police budgets across jurisdictions. Recommendation 14.2 in the task force report asks to tie a portion of the funding to performance expectations. This is something that council can consider if they choose to move forward with a funding formula, and we discuss this later in the report. Recommendation 14.3 in the task force report recommends taking any additional funding that would have gone to EPS under the previous funding formula and using it to fund the community and make investments in other urgent areas. Council has done this partially by taking the EPS funding reduced in 2021 and 2022 and reallocating it to financial strategies where it's being held for the purposes of community safety and well-being. During the 2022 budget deliberations in the fall, City Council also reduced EPS funding by an additional $10.9 million, which we've also held. That brings us to today. As mentioned in our opening remarks, we're here today to present to the committee and council options and mechanisms to allocate funding to EPS starting in 2023. Earlier this week, administration presented its community safety and well-being strategy and framework. Funding decisions for EPS will need to be made in the context of the city's overall community safety and well-being strategy.
Ms. Padbury, can I stop you for a minute? Kids, don't leave. Just quickly, I know you gotta go, but I got a note that we have kids from Dr. Donald Massey, grade 3 students class, and the teacher, Mazad El Tawil. Welcome to City Hall, and have fun. And looking forward to probably seeing you in the out there in the hallways, and obviously in the main room. Yeah. Oh, which ward would that be? Donald Massey School. Wardene.
Wardene.
Oh, Wardene. Cool. Have fun, kids. Yeah. Sorry. It's always fun to recognize kids in the school, in the city hall. Yeah.
Funding decisions for EPS need to be made in the context of the city's overall community safety and well-being strategy, and an integrated approach is required. The presumed connection between the demand for policing services and the funding and implementation of the community there is a presumed connection between demand for policing services and the funding and implementation of the community safety and well-being strategy. When determining the amount of funding and method whereby funding is allocated to EPS, consideration must be given to the interrelationship between community safety, well-being, and policing. We will discuss this important link later in this presentation. Next slide, please. Before a discussion of the funding mechanism options, we thought it would be important to provide an overview of the currently suspended EPS funding formula. Under this formula, the annual funding for EPS is the prior year operating budget increased by population growth and inflation and decreased by an efficiency factor. The base budget is defined as the prior year net operating requirement or tax levy funding, plus the so net operating required is expenditures less revenue, plus the transfer from the Automated Safety and Enforcement Reserve, which accumulates automated enforcement revenues. The formula linked growth to two factors. The first is population growth. As population levels increase in Edmonton, financial support to provide police services was aligned. Population growth is calculated by the city's corporate economist and informed by federal population statistics. The second factor was inflation. The inflation factor ensures that EPS's operating budget was in line with price changes for the goods and services purchased by EPS on an annual basis. To address inflation, the city's corporate economist developed an inflation factor called the Police Price Index that reflects a typical basket of goods that EPS is required to purchase. Following the protocol for the City of Edmonton's Municipal Price Index, the Police Price Index methodology would be reviewed and revised every 5 years to capture spending pattern changes in the EPS operating budget. While growth was linked to these factors and driven by statistical data, the formula also included an efficiency factor that council could adjust to meet the current economic climate or demands on the city budget. The inclusion of an efficiency factor was intended to replicate what civic departments were asked to achieve through the efficiency exercise, and the policy made it clear that City Council's expectations were that EPS would contribute to any citywide cost reduction strategies. Next slide, please. In determining the funding for EPS, it's also important to understand the roles and responsibilities of City Council, the Edmonton Police Commission, and Edmonton Police Services. City Council is responsible for establishing the commission and the appointment of its members. Council also ratifies the appointment of the Chief of Police. In terms of funding, Council approves the total amount or envelope of funding for EPS. The Edmonton Police Commission is responsible for recruiting and providing direction to the Chief of Police. From a budget perspective, the Commission prepares the overall budget request in consultation with the Chief of Police. Once the funding amount is approved by City Council, the Commission manages the allocation of Council-approved funding towards policing priorities. The Edmonton Police Service carry out policing duties in accordance with the Police Act and with oversight from the Edmonton Commission. The budgetary process, but administration makes no recommendation on the level of funding to EPS. While EPS is a part of the corporation of the City of Edmonton, there is a financial separation, and administration does not have the detailed insight into the financial operations of EPS. The level of funding is discussed between City Council and the Edmonton Police Commission. I'm now going to pass it to Harm Rai to walk through the current funding and the options proposed.
Next slide. Thanks, Stacey. So this table reflects the original funding provided to EPS at the start of the 2019 to 2022 operating budget cycle and the most current funding levels as a result of previous reductions. The original tax levy funding allocated to EPS is shown on the far left column on this slide. Moving one column over, on July 6, 2020, City Council reduced the EPS operating budget starting in 2021 by $11 million in total on a permanent basis, with the reduction split over 2021 and 2022. During the fall 2021 budget deliberations, City Council further reduced the EPS operating budget starting in 2022 by an additional $10.94 million on an ongoing basis. In total, the funding for EPS was reduced by $21.9 million on a permanent basis. These amounts were reallocated to financial strategies to be used for community safety and well-being purposes. As mentioned earlier, as a portion of the EPS annual operating funding provided through the funding formula is allocated from automated enforcement revenues within the Traffic Safety and Automated Enforcement Reserve. Over the 2019 to 2022 budget cycle, this has been $22.3 million a year. The total annual operating funding provided to EPS is reflected in the last column on the table on the right and is a combination of the tax levy funding and the funding from the Traffic Safety Automated Enforcement Reserve. For 2022, the total operating funding is $407.2 million. This is the base operating funding that would have been used in the currently suspended funding formula as the starting point for determining the 23 to 26 funding amounts. So we want to emphasize that the funding formula considered EPS operating funding as one envelope. So if the funding from the Traffic Safety and Automated Enforcement Reserve were to decrease, the formula would have required an increase to tax levy funding to make the funding envelope whole. This aspect is an important one and should be kept in mind for later today when considering the automated enforcement revenue shortfall and resulting traffic safety and automated enforcement reserve financial sustainability challenges through the Investing in Safe and Livable Streets reports, as EPS is one of the more significant items being funded from the declining photo enforcement revenues. Next slide. So earlier this week, the city's community safety and wellbeing strategy was presented to committee. As discussed in the strategy, multiple organizations play a role in the overall community safety and wellbeing outcomes linked to the strategy's 7 pillars. From a funding perspective, much of the funds for the strategy are currently provided through the City of Edmonton Civic Department budgets, Edmonton Police Services operating budget, and other orders of government. The city continues to advocate for additional support from other levels of government. The services provided and actions taken through the community safety wellbeing strategy and its 7 pillars may have an impact on the demand for services currently provided by Edmonton Police Services. As we identified earlier, Council needs to make 2 decisions related to EPS funding. Ultimately, City Council will decide on the appropriate level of funding, base funding for Edmonton Police Services. A decision on the level of funding cannot be made in isolation, and Council decisions on the implementation of the community safety wellbeing strategy, and will likely inform any decisions on police funding. This funding decision is a Council decision that should be made in context of the overall strategy and in discussions with Edmonton Police Commission. This is also why you won't see any detailed financial analysis on EPS budgets within the report in front of you today. The focus of the report in front of you today is the mechanism by which funding should be provided to EPS and adjusted on an ongoing basis in a reasonable manner. The report provides 3 funding mechanism options for consideration. Next slide. The first option is to align EPS funding with the existing Civic Department budget process, returning to the method used before the funding formula was put in place in 2016. Once the 4-year budget is approved by City Council, EPS would return as necessary during the supplemental operating budget process with service packages to discuss any increase in funding for additional services. This option may be beneficial as it's transparent and familiar to both Council and EPS. It provides insight into factors contributing to funding or service level increases. A drawback of this option is that service packages requiring approval from Council may be perceived as overriding the authority of the Edmonton Police Commission in determining allocation of funds to provide policing services. This challenge was also raised by the City Auditor in 2017 in their report. Furthermore, there would be less predictability and funding for Edmonton Police Services, potentially impacting their long-term planning and ability to adapt service levels. The second, and administration's recommended option, is to introduce a revised funding formula with a change or revision as directed by Council. Some possible revisions for Council's consideration are included in the report and include more frequent updates to growth and inflation factors, maximum annual increases to the EPS operating budget, considering factors such as average percentage expenditure growth of other civic departments, annual tax levy increases across all civic departments, average historical tax increases for the entire city, percentage growth in property tax revenues, or a predetermined dollar amount of a percentage increase. Performance metrics and related funding amounts can also be considered in a new funding formula. When aligning the EPS budget to other civic departments, consideration should be given to differing circumstances and factors impacting resourcing levels and service delivery requirements in varying service lines. Priorities and resource allocations can shift over the 4-year budget cycle. This is important to note if Council chooses to align EPS to other essential services such as transit or fire rescue. The upside of a revised funding formula is that it's established an easily understood process and provides predictability. Similar to the currently suspended formula, the revised formula could continue to mandate that EPS be a part of all corporate reduction exercises and adhere to the overarching corporate budget targets and goals. Continuation of the efficiency factor would allow Council an opportunity to annually adjust EPS funding amounts, if required. A formula would eliminate the need for EPS to return to Council with additional funding requests throughout the 4-year cycle, as EPS would need to manage budget pressures within the existing funding. On this same note, there would be a reduced perception of council directing the commission about operations. On the other hand, a funding formula can reduce the perceived transparency of EPS funding and allocation to services. Most importantly, funding by formula can create issues of inequity within the corporation. In the past, during periods of economic challenges and fiscal constraint, council has limited tax increases by approving budget reductions for civic departments and related services, while EPS received planned increases as dictated by the formula. That being said, administration is recommending a funding formula. Some of the drawbacks mentioned here can be mitigated through revisions to the formula and use of all levers within the formula for council to manage EPS funding, such as the efficiency factor and the right for council to request EPS to be involved in any budget reduction exercises. The last option mentioned in the report should only be applied if council decides to further reduce EPS operating funding. This is an interim approach that allows for a gradual decrease to EPS funding or a freeze in funding levels over a set period of time until council lands on their preferred funding amount. This option could be applied if council feels the implementation of the community safety and well-being strategy will reduce demands on EPS, but needs time to understand the overall impact and determine a longer-term EPS funding strategy. It would also provide EPS with time to determine and adjust resources to a decrease in funding. Most importantly, the strategy would allow for service levels to stabilize and minimize any negative impacts of changes in service delivery to residents. This option could be perceived as deferring a required decision on council's funding for EPS. If this option is selected, a definitive date should be established for the long-term approach towards EPS funding. There is also potential for EPS service level impacts resulting in real or perceived risks to public safety with a decrease in funding. Next slide. So in terms of next steps, if City Council approves the recommendation in the report today, administration would work with the Edmonton Police Commission and the Edmonton Police Services and would return during the 23 to 26 budget deliberations this fall with a revised funding formula for police services that could be implemented for the 23 to 26 budget. Direction would be required from City Council on revisions to be incorporated into the proposed funding formula. Edmonton Police Service would bring forward a proposed operating budget that is in line with the proposed funding formula and reflects annual increases as suggested by the formula. If Council does not support the revised funding formula, and in absence of any other direction, EPS will complete the 23 to 26 budget following the same process as other civic departments, presenting to Council their proposed operating budget request for 23 to 26 and rationalizing increases through service package requests like other civic departments. Additionally, funding for police service-related collective bargaining settlements would need to be set aside within the city's financial strategies account, potentially resulting in a tax increase. If Council requires more time to finalize the longer-term funding strategy for EPS, consideration can also be given to only establishing the 2023 operating budget for police services, with no increases for 24 to 26 at this time, and revisiting the 24 to 26 budget later in 2023 through a revised funding formula. That concludes our presentation, and we'd be happy to answer questions when appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation, and I understand that Police Commission is part of the delegation of administration to answer questions.
That's correct.
Okay, great. Okay. And so there are 2 points. One is determining the base level funding, and the other one is mechanism for future funding.
That's correct.
And I would encourage committee and council members to ask our questions. Our questions should revolve around those two main points. Okay, good. All right, so committee members? So sorry, we do have speakers, of course. Thank you, Councilor Rutherford. All right, we have a number of public speakers on this item. And I will run through their names to see if they are here. But before I do that, I will briefly explain the process. The speakers will be heard in panels, and each speaker will have 5 minutes to present. The clerk will run the official timer in council chamber. The timer lights on the podium will be green for the first 4 minutes, turn yellow when there is 1 minute remaining, and flash red when the 5 minutes are up. If you're participating virtually, you may wish to use a timer of your own. When everyone in your panel has had a chance to present, members of the council may ask questions of you or other panel members. For this reason, you may wish to remain in the meeting until all questions have been asked of your panel. If you're participating virtually, please remember to mute your microphone when you are not speaking. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please reach out to the office of the city clerk using the contact information provided in your confirmation of registration or at city.clerk@edmonton.ca. If you're here with us in person, the clerk will guide you to your seat when it's your turn to speak. As Edmonton transitions from provincial mask mandates and city temporary mask bylaw, we ask visitors to council chamber to be kind and respectful of each other. And you can wear a mask to protect yourself or those around you, or please respect people's personal choice and decisions around wearing masks. In the event of an emergency, please follow the clerk's direction to evacuate. City staff will direct you to your muster point. I'll go through the list of the speakers. Wayne Gerbois. Wayne, can you please come see the city clerk? Haroon Ali. Haroon, you're there. And Alex Heku. Alex is she is virtually joining us. Alex, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Just questions only, though.
To answer questions only, okay. And Pamela Brown, Edmonton City Center, to answer questions only. Pamela, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
And Rob Hoole, remotely participating. Rob, are you there?
Present.
All right, okay. And Shalini Sinha, virtually. Shalini, are you there? Shalini? We'll check back once we conclude the presentation from other speakers. So I'll start with Mr. Wayne Gerbois. Wayne, you're the first one.
Yes, good morning. There's been so much conjecture as where the $22.3 million out of the Photo-Radar Reserve Fund to support a tax-based police service, and it's been coming the last 4 years. If you give 22.3 out of the Photo-Radar Reserve, which you have allocated, it has also been said there's no money for safety initiatives or activities regarding anything to do with the crosswalks, the lights, and there's no money left. We've heard this. Why is there no money left? Because they'll say that the province has taken too much money. Now, you are voluntarily paying them 49.9% out of every ticket, and your expected revenue last October for photo radar was $110 million. Your own ATE website says 40%. So 49% of $110 million is $55 million. You got 20% for victim services, and that's $22 million. You got 22.3 for the police, which you've done for the last 4 years. That's 23.3 million. You're at $100 million payout, and you haven't paid for the program yet. So what I'm going to do is give you $10 million to run the program. And you add up those numbers, it's 110, and the expected revenue is 110. Now, it isn't going to be 110 because your photo radar has log-jammed the courts up to 36 months for trials, and you still don't have money back from 2020. We have court dates into February 24. That means the money isn't coming there, and you're 9% down. So I'm all for paying the police. You said right up there that it's going to be $385 million on the tax base, and you're going to add $22.3 million out of photo radar money, which leaves nothing. To me, you have to pay the police and tell the citizens of Edmonton that your photo radar system, which we know doesn't work, and all it is doing is plugging the courtrooms 2 days a week, 2 prosecutors, 2 clerks, 2 judges, and you don't want to pay, you're crying because it's 4.9% paid. They're charging you a user fee, folks. All you're doing is filling up courtrooms to 2024. And if you pay the police 22.3, there's no money for any initiatives, traffics, you name it. So we say that the revenue is down, and I told you that most of the revenue is down because even if I got a ticket in 2021, I don't have to pay for 2 years. And then I don't have to pay for 2 more years because I registered my car 2 years. So all your revenue money is gone, and I would maybe say you're going to make $102 million if everything works. Your courts were closed 8 months, and in 2020, I approached council and told them this, and everyone said, "Not what am I going to do about it?" I sent a few emails, and Michael knows because I've been discussing with Michael, and he knows. And I'm back in October, I emailed him and told him this was going to happen. He knew it was going to happen. So you've got 2 choices, the way I see it, 3 maybe. You take 22.3 out of photo radar money and have no initiatives. That's 2022 with no fixing of the roads for safety, lights, traffic, crosswalks, you name it. Then, or you leave the 2.3 in the photo radar money, because remember, it's by the ATE's own website, it's for safety initiatives and safety activities, not forward into the police department, and the money is not supposed to go in general revenue by your own decree. So you take the 22.3 million and leave it in there and make all your traffics and everything you want to do, but you're going to have to take the 22.3 out of the tax base. And we saw you only have 383 allocated, 385. And every 17 million is what, 1% increase? So you're a catch-22 with this because nobody realized the amount of money that's not coming in. I've seen the court cases, the resolutions, the withdrawals, adjournments, 36 months for $110. People turn around and say, I went 11 over once in 14 years because my car downshifted. I'm not going to pay $110 for that. But it's Orwellian the way those cameras work. Guy slides through an intersection, icy day. You shouldn't have been traveling that fast. And basically, when we come to a ticket for photo radar and say that I'm not in the intersection, photo radar says, it's left our department, not our problem. So I'm going to make a court date. And 3 years down the line, maybe I'll see you. You got to check all those problems before you just say, I'm going to pull 22.3 out of photo radar. Jack Schultz said it the best, that it's under the false pretense of safety. So you're not saving anything. Basically, that's what you're doing is paying a user fee. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Galboa. And next we'll go to Harun Ali.
Yeah, awesome. First off, let me just say thank you so much to City Administration and City Manager's Office for preparing this. I know it's a lot of work, and I know these conversations are tough, but are necessary. Yeah, so what's called, from my understanding and from looking at what's called the funding formula, I would suggest and I would urge Council to essentially what's called go with the third option, to allow for time to see what the community well-being strategy actually looks like, and then to make choices from there and seeing what our options are. My reason being is that what I fear, and this is a problem that the last council had, was that we, to an extent, we kept increasing police funding as we wanted to see more service. But the problem with that is that we actually have no idea, and as administration pointed out, we actually have no idea where the police spend money, and we don't actually even know how much the police chief makes. So the reality is we don't even know if they would spend the money on increasing patrols or doing anything. All we can do is take them at their word, and that's a problem. They are the only city service in recent history, even during the pandemic when we were cutting the library, that haven't received a reduction. You know what I mean? In a time of, you know what I mean, where we need to be careful with our budgets, I think we also need to be transparent with where we're spending money as a city. Policing is one of the largest items on the Edmonton city budget. So we need to be extremely cautious in ensuring that we're spending money in the right areas, and I would encourage council as well to make sure that we're doing that. But furthermore, too, we also need to make sure, too, that that even looking at the community well-being strategy, there are a lot of great suggestions there that can actually solve the problems that we're facing. The reality is that the reason why our city right now is in the state it is because of chronic underfunding by our province. We have an opioid crisis here, and we're we're not going to be able to solve it by adding more money to policing, because police officers are not social workers. Police stations are not safe consumption sites. What we need to do, and what we should be doing here, is we should be urging the province to reinstate full funding for safe consumption sites, so that we have them in our city and accessible. We should also be encouraging council, the province as well, to really make sure that we're actually ensuring that we're funding shelters. And I know that our city, we're taking steps to do that, which is phenomenal. But I just don't see how adding more police funding is in line with what City Council committed to the community back in 2020, or what they committed to, especially with the strategy. Because I think what we should be doing is we should be looking at what the community well-being strategy actually looks like, then evaluating funding decisions from there. There's no reason, I don't see any reason right now to rush this decision. I think even waiting for a year or two to see how things actually roll out, to see the impact of investments that we're making as a city before making a decision would be phenomenal. And I also think too, it would also help us as well, because as the police chief said himself, 33% of policing is spent on actually doing social work. So why should we be spending that 33% on policing? We should be spending that 33% on social work, so we can actually get the right people to do the right job. And that's all the community really wants, is that I just don't see how sending what's called an officer to go deal with an unhoused person that's sleeping in our station is an effective use of resources. It isn't. We should be sending a social worker there that can diagnose the issue, see if they can give them the support that they need, and move forward from there. So once again, I would urge council to go with the third option, to look at the report, what's called, to implement a temporary measure, and then to look at doing a further one down the road in a year or two. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. Next, we'll go to Mr. Abhul.
Hello, thank you, Council. Thanks for letting me speak today. I must be transparent. I am a strategic advisor in Councillor Stevenson's office, but I am here appearing on my own volition and carrying forward my work from the task force that made recommendations previously regarding police funding in Edmonton. And just to carry on with what Mr. Ali was saying, the Edmonton Police Service continues to be the only service and organization within the city of Edmonton that is not being held to their own metrics, that they really can do no worse with their performance and face any consequences whatsoever in their funding envelope. We know that according to their own data, 92% of the calls that they face are nonviolent in nature, and that just over 30% of their calls are social disorder related. We know that in the past years, they have missed their priority 1 response times, they have missed their proactive patrol times, they have missed their weighted clearance rates, they have missed their call evaluation timelines, and they have missed their complaint investigation timelines. So all of the metrics that they were tracking, they have missed, and they continue to miss, yet they continue to receive escalating funding. We saw from the council, from administration's report, even though funding was frozen in 2020, they still have received escalating amounts year after year. They've now received a maximum of $384 million, even with the reductions, adding the 22.3, still over $400 million a year. That's over $1 million a day for policing in Edmonton, which is kind of above and beyond other municipalities. I'm a little bit disturbed that there wasn't a real transparent and comparative analysis done on what other municipalities are spending, because in Vancouver, they spend about $1 million a day on policing as well, and continue to have issues with public scrutiny, other things like that. Through the work of the task force, we examined what a redistribution of that social disorder call numbers would look like. We threw out some percentages around 36% to 27% to even just a 10% reallocation or reduction, which based upon the 2021 numbers would be $40 million. And we know that the community is in dire need of investments, and that there are things happening that are changing some of the outcomes, but we need to do more as city council, and They need to make a real strong push to freeze the funding to a further degree. I would say even roll it back to 2019 numbers, which is where we really saw and came to light these problems with a dedicated funding formula and how instead of budgeting for doing a good job, the Edmonton Police Service has instead budgeted for other things in anticipatory costs and spending, purchasing new materials and new equipment when maybe things aren't ending their end of life, other things like that. We've saw a real push away from a real lack of transparency around what the police are doing with their funding. As Mr. Ali said, we don't know how much the police chief makes. We don't know. There was some discussion the other day about how many officers are actually patrolling at any given time. It wavered between 19 to 40 to 60 to 151. That tells me that there's a real issue with how police are doing their work and how they can respond to crises and how they can stop crimes as they're intended to do. I really want to stress that missing the priority one times is a key indication that maybe the system isn't working. If for those that are not familiar, priority one times is crisis, someone in immediate personal danger and possibly death or serious injury. The police will get to you on average within over 7 minutes. Their goal to reach you is usually around 6.5 minutes, 6 minutes. They're missing that goal. That means if you're intending on police to come and save you, if you're in a dire circumstance, you're going to have to fight off your attacker or whomever for at least 7 minutes before Edmonton Police Service can arrive to save the day. That is a number for anyone who's been in a dire circumstance. 7 minutes is an eternity, and it is not a reflection of community safety. There needs to be an overhaul on how police are doing their work, and that begins with adequately funding and freezing and redistributing the way that we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hull. And I'll check again if Ms. Shalini Sena, oh, there she is. Shalini, over to you.
Thank you very much. You know me as the chair of the city's Anti-Racism Advisory Committee, and I just want to make it clear that I'm speaking here from that position in terms of that vantage point and bringing that voice here, and also that my particular points should be held accountable to me and me alone personally. We've heard about the need to be mindful of the relationship between police funding and community safety and well-being. And I wish to remind you that there is a need to make sure that there's a relationship between police funding and anti-racism. An anti-racist perspective does not further the needs of a small few, but it is a perspective that accounts for all people's histories and experiences against false assumptions and stereotypes, and in this way illuminates hidden forces of oppressive power used by some against others. If an anti-racist perspective is not there, we are never getting the whole picture and we are not seeing the structures of power. It helps us to move towards increased connection, human healthfulness, and the social development and success for all people in our community when we bring an anti-racist perspective. Less than 2 years ago, for the first time, many members of our community who normally find themselves socially excluded found the courage and strength to come forward to speak about their experiences of violence and exclusion and the knock-on effects this has. It is a triumph when these voices find their ways to these discussions, and it is no surprise when they are absent, as they have been mostly absent in these discussions this week and here today. I find that I take a personal commitment to stand here in that role as chair of the Anti-Racism Advisory Committee to make sure that these voices aren't forgotten and heard, even when I am in the minority. And I ask council to always hold those voices present in discussions, even when they aren't present, actually present. I understand that the organization of the police has been struggling with difficulty because many changes have been made very quickly to their budget and they haven't had a chance to catch up. I'm also grateful for the $1.174 million that was recently allocated for non-policing community safety initiatives, and recently the 2 million that was allocated towards the anti-racism strategy. These 3 million from the non-increase to the police budget recently, the 22 million that was held back, represents 13% of the money held back to go into initiatives that are non-policing anti-racist community safety initiatives. And if we look at the overall budget, generously 0.75% of the overall policing budget has currently and for the first time been allocated towards creating some actions that are non-policing, anti-racist community safety actions. There has not been enough time yet to activate this money into actions that could show you an outcome and stand for a new and different voice of how to fund safety outside of policing. Furthermore, the fact that safety has been handled entirely from the policing perspective until now means that there wasn't investment into infrastructure, into community safety and anti-racist non-policing initiatives that could help reduce the, threat that people face in their communities and businesses. I appreciate that the police have been suffering with only the small increases in the last few years, but I ask Council to stay the course with the intent of the Safer for All report and to allow us time to invest in non-policing community safety. We came to councillors over the last year and informed them that it is well known in many jurisdictions that when police funding budgets appear to be reduced, that a campaign of a narrative to demonstrate that there is not enough resources to deliver frontline services in critical areas and that safety has gone down as a direct result of the change in the police budget is a commonplace activity. And we are here now today in Edmonton, and we don't have the infrastructure and the ability to counter that point of view. So I'm asking you to stay the course and to keep investing in non-policing and ask the police to do what everyone else has been asked to do, which is take the time to reorganize your budget, put policing where it's needed in the money that you have, which is almost $500 million. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sinha, for your presentation and everyone else. And I'll go to council members if they have any questions to members of the public. Councillor Stevenson.
Yes, thank you. Thanks to all of our speakers this morning. Just a quick question for you, Mr. Ali. You mentioned, the public feeling that they don't have the information they need around the police budget. Just wondering if you could maybe just share some thoughts about some of those specific questions that you might have to want answered, just to inform some of the questions we may ask.
Yeah, what's called for Toronto, for example, what's called people that live in Toronto actually know how much their police chief makes. The reason why it's important to know how much our police chief makes is because it shows transparency. If there's no problem with how much he's being paid, then there shouldn't be an issue with revealing that amount. I would also suggest too knowing how much money we're spending in each precinct and each area of the city. Knowing about how much we're spending on policing specifically, how much time we're also spending when it comes to social issues, and how much time, even looking at how much deferred maintenance may cost if they have that, and just really looking at more so what's called the costs associated with policing and getting a better understanding. Because once again, and as the last speaker mentioned, is that every single time that police funding is brought up, the first line of defense and that some people bring up is that safety is going to go down. And I think we should know what that exactly means and about how much money we give the police and where they actually spend it. Because that transparency is crucial. You know what I mean? Why are the police the only department in the city that don't technically have an actual real public budget?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for some of those ideas. No further questions for me. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you so much. I'll next go to Councillor. See, look at the committee members. Councillor Cardwell. Councillor, there is Councillor Rice, yes, sorry, Councillor Rice, I missed that. Here we go, Councillor Rice. I should check actually I change it to here, I'll change here you go. No, it's right in front of me. I was looking at that one, so hard to see.
That's
Need bigger
okay,
glasses.
Mr. Mayor. So thank you everybody, and for our public speakers come this morning to speak. I do have one quick question, and then to Mr. Rob Hall. So you mentioned some metrics, and you used to measure and how our police work and to meet some goals. So my question is about where is that metrics come from?
Those are the metrics that the Edmonton Police Service themselves track. That's the data that they collect and report on annually as a justification for the funding that they receive.
So if that is the case, how did we get the results that did meet the goals?
Well, I think one of the goals of the task force and recommendations was for us to start tracking different metrics and more appropriate metrics as opposed to complaint times and proactive patrol times. Maybe we should be tracking other things like the CSI, the Crime Severity Index, and actual incidences of violent crime as opposed to what we see in the media and other things like that where it's being skewed. We need to look at a better metric to weigh exactly how efficient police are being and how they're doing in responding to crime. But the most salient example of where there is an issue with safety is they're missing their priority 1 calls. They're spending more time on priority 2 and 3 and 4 and missing the boat on the priority 1, which again is the most life-critical, life-saving priority response time. And that speaks to maybe officers are doing other things as opposed to being patrolling and being at the ready to respond to those priority 1 calls.
Okay, thank you for that. And then I just want to go back, focus on my questions. So if that is information and publicly, and then so I think we can find that online or somewhere. My question is related, and when is this results? And I do believe EPS, they have performance measures in place, and they have the comprehensive evaluation tools in place. So if we talk about the results, what these results specifically refer to the when? Which year? And is it overall and 3 years, 5 years, or just start last year or start 2020? And after the first time our police was defunded?
So as we were doing the work on the task force, we examined data that was available for subsequent years leading up to 2020 and 2021. So it was a snapshot of the last 5 years of policing in Edmonton. So it was, again, we wanted to examine when the funding formula was put into place and how performance was either lowering or escalating depending on how the funding formula was guaranteeing the Edmonton Police Service's escalating costs.
Thank you very much for bringing this information to our attention. I'm looking forward to see the entire picture and how that reflects in our police's website and for the results and the metrics. And thank you again, so I yield my time.
Thank you, Councillor Rice. Councillor Rutherford?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Singha, are you still there? Great.
Yes.
You said something that really spoke to my heart, and as a new council member, I wasn't here for that public hearing back in 2020, but I do hold heavy in my heart those kind of voices that came out and spoke and don't want us to lose that course. Could you just spend a little bit of time elaborating on, for maybe especially the new council colleagues, on what some of the key messages were from those speakers that you remember that stuck with you?
Yeah, thank you very much. So the key messages from those speakers, they were trying to bring forward their experience of when they're mistreated by the police and how certain groups of people, so our African descent, Black people, our Indigenous people, our 2S LGBTQ, trans people, our people suffering mental health, our people suffering houseless and homelessness in particular, are on the edge of undue force and mistreatment and also being targeted by police. And in what they were trying to bring forward, and I believe it was extremely courageous and it was part of a global support and awareness to be able to share that experience and be heard for the first time and not be dismissed and overwhelmed. And the solutions that they were asking for was that funding be considered not just with policing, but with also social measures and anti-racist measures that help to address and strengthen those communities and address those generational and trauma experiences so that there's less of that conflict on the front lines.
Okay, and to Mr. Houle, in the presentation from administration, they use the term reduced funding. Would that be your assessment as a public member of what happened at the fall supplementary budget?
Well, I think once people of the public look at the report as it's written and look at the tabling that's provided, it's a pretty clear indication that the Edmonton Police Service hasn't had any reduced funding since 2019. It's clear as day. They received $378 million total funding in 2019, and this year they are on track to receive $407.2 million. That is an escalation in funding, regardless of the so-called freeze that was initiated.
And what do you think? One of the tensions that I'm struck by is that tension between the presentations that happened over the last couple of days where we're talking about, long time change, and as somebody that's worked in the systems change field, there's usually a lag time before you start to see the indicators, positive or negative, of any significant changes. What do we do in that stopgap? Do you have any suggestions for that? Because if we're saying, okay, let's not increase the funding, but we're hearing that there is a lack of resources and capacity, and we haven't had the time to see the benefits of those community investments. Any thoughts on that?
Well, again, I really challenge the messaging around there's been a lack of capacity and a lack of resources provided, because we're seeing crime rates go down. We're seeing there may be pockets of increased disorder and other things like that, but we also have data analysis from groups within the city that say, in actuality, the social disorder transit issues aren't really going up. It's just that the amplification of them is rising through social media and other things like that. So I think we need a real, truthful, transparent examination of what the impacts we've seen to date are, and that begins with budget transparency, where workforces are, where they're being distributed, because again, we've seen attrition within the city's own ranks. We've seen people getting massive layoffs, yet one organization has stood above them all and received escalating funding, even with crime and workloads going down. And that speaks to a real disparity within priorities and a disparity in how people are treated, and Edmontonians should be concerned about that.
Thank you. And then my last question quickly is to Mr. Gabois. I just want to get clarity. So are you suggesting that we do not give the police the $22.3 million from the traffic reserve? Is that, I'm just trying to understand specific to the conversation at hand with item 6.1. Is that what you were getting at, or do you want the police to still see that 22.3? I didn't get that clarity.
I think the problem is you have allocated 22.3 to the police from photo radar money, and that money does not exist if you do that and still maintain the traffic initiative activities. So you give it to them because you've been doing it for 4 years. Now you'd go a whole year of photo radar with no activities. And that's on everybody who decided they want to offset the tax base by using photo radar money, which was never supposed to be in the first place.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I'm out of time. I appreciate that
clarity.
clarity.
No worries, thanks.
All right, Councillor Cartmel.
Thank you, Mayor Sohi. My questions are for Mr. Houle. Thank you for joining us today. I understood you to say that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that the police are essentially tracking the wrong things in terms of metrics. They should track different things. But then I also heard you refer to the priority one calls, which is something that the police service tracks. And I think you said something about if you're fighting for your life, you're going to have to wait for 7 minutes. And so the remedy to that situation is to reduce the police budget. Am I following your thread of logic correctly?
Well, no, the solution to that is to make sure that police are doing their appropriate job, which is community safety, and being on hand to respond to those priority one calls.
So you're suggesting that when the call goes out for a priority one call, squad cars aren't answering the call, they're just doing something else?
Well, I think we also heard that with some of the transit officer conversations in the last couple of months around how transit peace officers were calling for police support and there was a lack of response. There was some social media back and forth with the head of the EPA and other people around some misinformation around that. So again, we at the task force found that the police are doing other things. 36% of their work is social disorder related. And that means that an officer is not necessarily required. If they're no longer doing that 36% of work.
Mr. Houle, just let me stop you right there. You said priority one calls where you're fighting for your life. And now you just said that we should have other appropriate resources respond to those calls. Do you think that someone other than a police officer is going to respond to a call where someone's fighting for their life?
Actually, that's not what I said.
Okay,
I said that police are doing other things that they cannot respond to that priority one call. They're doing traffic investigations, they're doing collision reports, they're doing other non-necessary things that other institutions, organizations, and municipal employees could do that makes police available to respond to that priority one call. Because 7 minutes is a long time. I think Edmontonians should realize that if you're relying on the police to come and save you, the data shows they will not be there for at least 7 minutes.
Okay. And you think the reason for that is because they're too busy filling out traffic reports that they don't come to the priority one calls?
I think the police chief himself has said that the police officers deal with 36% of their work is not police related and shouldn't be police related. He himself has said that council has accepted that position. So I think the funding and the workload should follow that kind of course of action.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Cartmel. Councillor Jans.
Thank you. May I ask Miss, I can't pronounce that, Hercue? Alex Hercue?
Sure.
Are they with us? Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask, following the presentation from the Downtown Committee and noting appreciation for the response, or the correspondence previously, I wanted to ask if you had, I thought I saw you in part of the audience. I wasn't sure if you had heard all the presentation, but did you hear from the police that 19.1% of their calls had came from downtown?
Yes, I was there for that presentation.
And would you expect then that around 19.1% of their officers would be stationed or assigned to downtown to assist?
I believe that they're under-resourced right now and severely have been affected by different cuts in COVID to their force. And so while I'd expect that, I don't know that that is the reality that we see.
Yeah, that's what we were trying to dig into a little bit too. I think one of the other speakers suggested between 18 and 151 members were downtown, which isn't even half of the component of officers that they would have if it was 19%. I think 19% would equate to 342 officers downtown. So for me, I was surprised to see, and it's still unclear to me why downtown is understaffed. But I'm glad to hear the mayor's motion and support from the service to be putting more resources downtown. So that's encouraging. I wanted to ask Mr. Houle, were you aware that last year around November, before our council was debating the budget, that the police opened a new animal control unit?
I am aware of that. They have some sort of animal control, animal welfare unit that has, I would say, some overlap with city services.
Yeah. Were you also aware that the police spend between $7 and $8 million per year for cars over the last 3 years?
I know that they do have a lofty equipment expenditure, and it makes up approximately, I think, 18% or 8% of their overall budget.
And were you aware of the 2 helicopters at $6 million each?
I am, and I am aware of their plane as well.
Yeah, at 4.5 million. And do you think this militarization, if you will, maybe even there might be a satellite, who knows, like this militarization of technology and equipment and distance between people on the ground and community, do you think this is closer to or further away from the goals of the Safer for All report?
I think it's a little bit farther away. Again, community safety, we know that a lot of BIPOC individuals are being unjustly persecuted and interacted with by these mechanisms and these instruments and these equipments. So I think it's a little bit of a departure from what Safer for All was looking for.
And I guess this is the hard part, because as I just asked the previous speaker, you know, they want more resources downtown, but you know, here we are, we're having these choices, and we as council have no control. Once we cut the check to the commission, it's up to them. And I noticed, I'm not sure if it came up at Safer for All, but did the question around marijuana funding, because I know before marijuana was legalized, there was a lot of reefer madness. People were worried that this was going to cause a lot of crime and a lot of disorder. Additional funding was allocated to the police in 2017. To my knowledge, it has not been returned, even though there's been no crime related to marijuana. I think it was documented there was like 8 calls about it. Yet millions had been invested by the city into this. So did this come up at Safer for All, just the lack of accountability we have once we cut a check?
It did. It also looked at how work was going to be done. We did talk a little bit about marijuana and how it's actually costing the city more with decriminalization as opposed to when it was criminalized, because now there was this understanding that more officers would be needed to do more roadside checks. But that was kind of a stretch for us, because if it's decriminalized now, do you really have to do that, to go to that extent to try to find people and do all these proactive policing and efforts when it's decriminalized now? So do you really need that funding? All those things came up at the task force conversations.
I'm out of time, but I have 2 questions for Ms. Sinha as well next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Jans. Councillor Principe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Houle, I just have a question. You had said that the EPS is the only service not held responsible for their budgeting. I, you know, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I do appreciate, you know, you looking for efficiencies, because I often do that too. I like to find efficiencies. Now, can you tell me, have you ever considered the accountability and efficiencies of the shelters or the homeless organizations?
I think that's one of the reasons why City Council is discussing a shelter minimum standards and things like that, to try to force the shelters to meet some sort of efficiency factors and to examine them. But again, I welcome that report or the motion from yesterday. I think it was yesterday, around looking at and examining the jurisdictions and the money that flows into the city, because there is this figure around $6.7 billion that flows into the city of Edmonton for charities and other organizations. I think that number is a little bit of a misnomer, and it really helps to misdirect the conversation away, holding people accountable for the money that they receive. And one organization we know that gets $1 million a day that people in the downtown aren't seeing the results is the police.
Okay. So really, no, just on the police. was kind of your answer?
Well, again, I think everyone should be responsible for the funding that they receive. I think if city council can take the steps, and this was part of some of the analysis I did on the kind of safer for all strategy, incorporating minimum shelter standards, then holding those shelters accountable and either clawing back support or withdrawing zoning mandates and things like that if people aren't performing, because we know and we have heard time and again that these institutions re-traumatize Indigenous clients. Yet we choose to do nothing because we don't have the jurisdiction, or we don't want to step on any toes. I think it's time, well past time. We saw with COVID how jurisdictional boundaries can be blended and pushed. I think we need to do things differently as a community.
Okay, and Mr. Ali, I heard you say that you were discussing social workers and how we need more social workers out in the community, and your statement was that is all the community really wants. Is that correct?
I said, yeah, that's correct.
Okay, but you were in on Monday when the other speakers were in, and many of them had said they want to see more of a police presence in Chinatown. Did you hear that as well?
I heard that. Can I respond to your question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So once again, I don't know. I don't believe you're here for this, Councilor Principe. But back in around June 2020, there was actually a conversation where a public hearing where it took about 3 days full of speakers who were discussing what the community wanted. And I would encourage you, I believe that you can find the video, and I would encourage you to watch it.
Yes, I do know, and I have seen that back from 2020. So thank you for pointing that out. But I was just mentioning about what we heard 2 days ago, because there is, there is a balance, right? There's always a balance and things that I feel. And I did hear from the community that said they need to see more of a police presence. So, and also, so I wanted to speak with Miss Hiraku. Alex? Are you still there, Alex?
I see her name there, but she's on mute.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just, maybe I'll come back for another round and see if I can chat with her. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councilor Principe. Councilor Tang.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And thank you so much to all the speakers taking time, for some of you, yet again, to come out and speak on this issue. Haroon, I really appreciate your presentation on Monday, and, your support for initiatives like COT. But I think one thing that keeps coming up for me is the issue of capacity, which has also come up today. And we've heard from administration that, trying to hire aggressively, whether it's social worker or outreach worker or mental health specialist, there's always going to be a lag. I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of the speed at which we're scaling initiatives like COT, or the ability to really, fill those positions and actually deploy resources on the ground. I just wondering if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would actually argue that COT should probably be expanded to should replace BCOPs, because the reality is that programs like COT actually give the proper support. And look, while it's hard to access and get support from social workers, as Panita pointed out on Monday, I think it's valuable, and I think it's far more valuable than sending people that shouldn't really be doing social work. And I also think too that while we're debating where money should be spent, I think it would be far better to spend this money and any increase that we would be spending on policing and on this initiative, because as we've seen, it's incredibly successful. This is a discussion that I know a lot of students want to see as well. I was actually having a discussion with a lot of students, and they like the COTS program because it addresses a lot of concerns the community has, while also giving the supports that a lot of folks also want too. So I would definitely encourage council to look at adding more funding to COTS rather than BCOPs. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and I think certainly there's no doubt there's a lot of support for it, but I think the challenge then is we can keep dedicating resource, but if we cannot deploy as quickly as we can, I think that will be a huge challenge. I guess I just have a second question, and I guess it's around the use of language. And to Mr. Hu, as a former member of the task force, I find that in all of this conversation, languages like defunding actually isn't very helpful. And I think it deters from what we're actually trying to talk about. And, I heard the presentation at the time when task force presented their recommendation report. And I felt that the chair was actually quite specific about, use of language and, and what we're actually trying to talk about here. Would you agree with that?
To a degree, yes. Defunding can become a very controversial and combative topic, especially when people from the public hear about defunding and the taking away of funds. But we know that in reality that has not taken place in Edmonton regarding the police service. So I think maybe we need to have a more nuanced conversation on exactly what the situation is to date and what has actually occurred, and that police have not received any less funding than they had in previous years, and they continue to receive escalating amounts.
Great, thank you so much for that. And that's it, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Tang. Councillor Salvador.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks so much to all of our speakers for being here today. Wanted to ask, I'll start with Mr. Houle. I wanted to talk a little bit more about, the importance of budgeting for doing a good job. I think that was a really important piece that you brought up. And when it comes to performance metrics and measuring the right things, I think the example of priority ones makes a lot of sense. But I wanted to ask you, do you think there's any, risk associated with EPS leading the sort of progress evaluations when it comes to informing funding? And is there an opportunity, or do you see an opportunity for having, a more independent way of measuring our progress towards community safety and well-being?
Well, in a perfect world and a perfect situation, that is one of the roles that the EPC would be fulfilling as an independent, community-oriented body responsible for determining budgeting amounts. They would be using independent mechanisms to evaluate the funding, its efficacy, whether or not it's having the impact on the ground, whether or not we're seeing property crime rates dropping, whether or not we're seeing the reflection in the community. And we're seeing kind of the adverse of that right now with the dashboard that's been created by the Edmonton Police Service to track incidents of crime and other things like that. It's showing up in wards and neighborhoods and highlighting what's happening and creating this image of social disorder and just rapid crime. Yet there's nothing to coincide with that around, well, how much are you investing in that community? How many patrols are you doing? How many beat cops are on the ground? And I think this conversation around the 19% of incidences in the downtown core with a lack of effective investment from the police force itself, again, points to that question around, well, then what are you tracking? What are your metrics? And how are you delineating the work to make Edmonton safer for all?
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that. And yeah, I'll probably have some questions around that to the commission as well. But I wanted to jump to Ms. Sinha as well. Shalini, still with us?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the time delay in seeing some of the results of diversion and detasking efforts. Because I think, folks are really eager to see those results. But of course, results take time. And how do we make sure that the pendulum doesn't swing in the other direction? You spoke about the importance of staying the course, and it just feels like we're kind of at that critical juncture where we're just starting to truly engage in that detasking and reinvestment work. Do you have any advice or learnings, even from other municipalities who are in a similar position?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Great question. So how do we make sure that the pendulum doesn't swing in the other direction? How do we stay the course? What are the ways? So I will bring that at the moment, the city's mechanism for bringing forward this other perspective is it's based in community advisory boards that are volunteer boards at the moment. We have worked very hard and fought for the anti-racism strategy, and I feel like when that is implemented, some of that will help. An independent anti-racism body that is, as we said, equitably funded to high benchmark standards will be able to do some of this work and help bring forward new initiatives from the community. But the delay at the moment is that, for example, while EPS are struggling with their budget and it's still 400 million, the anti-racism initiatives have just started in their maybe 3 million, but it's reliant on volunteers to be able to enact that. And the city hasn't yet moved to create a different structure that will help that to move faster. I will say that we had our very first meeting on the implementation of the anti-racism strategy last week on Friday, and we were hoping to have it 3 months ago. Now we know administration's been busy with Safety for All. We were hoping to be involved with that. And so I feel like there are city processes that are slowing down this mechanism.
Okay, and just really quickly with my last 30 seconds here, also to Ms. Sinha, you spoke about some of the sort of public communications campaigns that we've seen in other municipalities that are carried out by police agencies to essentially kind of suggest that reductions in funding will result in decreased safety. And those campaigns often kind of magnify some of the community safety issues that communities are facing. So I'm wondering, how do we get to a place where our conversations around community safety and well-being are rooted in evidence and data and the lived experiences of Edmontonians?
Yeah, absolutely. So we need those mechanisms where, I believe that independent body will help, because one of the mechanisms there is to collect data, is to have that trusting relationship with the community. That independent body is going to need to have as good a communication structure as the police have at the moment, so that it can help look for those other stories. I will say that budget decisions were made in November, and immediately the consistent reporting on attacks on LRT stations started instantly. And they do happen, and I'm not minimizing that in any way. But what I'm saying is that we haven't had any reporting on any other initiatives. We have had a consistent campaign that the elderly, that women are at risk constantly, and we have no other communications mechanism to challenge that view.
Thank you, Councillor Salvador. Councillor Wright. Councillor Wright.
Thank you. My questions are for Ms. Sinha as well. I'm just wondering, so one of the options that we're considering or put before us was to tie the funding into the performance, and I'm just wondering how you see sort of EPS being part of that community safety and well-being, and what pillars it ties into that we could base that performance measurement on.
Yeah, that's absolutely a great question. If I look to the strategy that administration brought forward on Monday, and they named 7 pillars there, if I look at them, they have anti-racism, reconciliation, equitable policies, pathways in and out of poverty, safe and inclusive spaces, and well-being. And I would say that EPS is involved with and tied to one of those pieces, which is crime prevention and crisis intervention. And that also helps create safe and inclusive spaces, but safe and inclusive spaces can't be considered, it's much bigger than that. If I look at other pillars that are important around community safety, and they're not framed this way in that strategy, the root causes of crime or violence, mental health supports or responses, social restoration or reconciliation, then I would say that EPS is not linked to any of those issues. What EPS is there for is that crisis intervention around violence. That is what EPS is there for. And I think if we continue as a society to focus all our funding on policing, we are basically saying that as a society, we allow ourselves to careen towards really extreme, urgent, violent issues without having the funding in for social restoration and prevention and healing in advance. Does
So
that?
then, how do you see then the other partners, I guess, that are identified in the strategy? How do you see them fitting into, I guess, the overall safety and well-being of Edmontonians?
Yeah, one of my main concerns about the strategy and the partners as they outline them is that there's still there's still the usual programs and the usual systems doing the same thing. And I feel like we need a stronger anti-racism and reconciliation lens on all of that. We do, I think, need to take some time with a strategy that we can implement quickly, not let 3 months, 6 months, a year go by, that helps to build up those anti-racist reconciliatory community action structures that will respond to some of these things. Our Indigenous people have suffered so much, and as a result of that have created incredible outlooks and programs for healing at the hardest places, and those need to be funded really well.
Okay, I think that was all I was going to ask for now. Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councillor Wright. So that concludes round one. I do have some questions. I'll start with Mr. Hoole on the, like, in your experience and your work, I like the way you framed the question around, responding to priority one. That's where police is needed, but there are other areas where police may not be the right responder, particularly on social issues or traffic or others. Have you seen in other communities if that transition has taken place, right? And if that transition has taken place, has it been disruptive transition, or has it been more a collaborative approach to making sure that we are changing things, but changing in a way that there's a smooth transition?
Yeah, so through the work of the task force, we examined many examples of crisis diversion, which again seems to be one of the best indications and approaches to non-police response. We examined and considered solutions, the Crisis Solution Center in Seattle, the Restoration Center in San Antonio, the Crisis Receiving Center in Tucson, the Access Center in Salt Lake City. There's a Crisis Respite Center in New York City. There's another one in Rhode Island. And then, of course, we have the example here in Edmonton around the 24/7 crisis diversion. And we also talked about the role that the counties can play and municipal governments can play around diverting certain kind of infractions. And they include trespass and minor drug offenses, decriminalization, prostitution, things like that, that don't necessarily need to be into the police and justice system, but can be diverted to other mechanisms as opposed to having a cop with a gun and a badge show up when they could be doing other things.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because in most cases at this time, if Edmontonians are looking for help, whatever that help might be, they look at 911, right? And because they have no other, maybe 211 to call, or 311 and city-related issues. I think that I think police may want to get there as well, but now they're the one who's responding. So I want to get your thoughts on that too, as Ms. Sena. Like, what did that transition look like from where the right people are responding to the right needs?
Okay, thank you. You're asking me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And what would the transition look like to get the right people responding to the right needs? I do think that we have some programs, as Mr. Hull mentioned, to start with. We also need to start creating some new dimensions to those programs that can support that. And I think the biggest struggle that we have right now is that we're in a power struggle. We all want the same aim, which is increased safety, increased quality of life, increased happiness, increased social experience for all Edmontonians. We all want the same thing. Our struggle is on how this is achieved and who should be achieving it. And from what I've noticed from the police over the last 2 years, their perspective is, we're listening to you. We are the ones that should be doing all of this. Just keep giving us the money. We will do it all. And I feel we need a recognition of where we are in this process, that the police should not be dominant in creating community safety. They're there to assist with crisis of violence. And the biggest struggle we have right now is I have noticed is people saying one thing and doing another thing, saying that they're listening, saying that they're taking it on board, but actually undermining the success of some of the other partners. So to create success in a collaborative way, we will need to very clearly frame whose role is what and have agreements that we're working together and stop having this saying one thing and doing another thing. We shouldn't be here arguing with each other. Why the police have $400 million and why we have underfunded infrastructure to the point where we don't have it to offer a partnership for safety.
So that collaborative approach to figuring out who does what, right? And okay, got it. And thank you for that, because I'm really concerned about. I know really the way you framed this is power struggle, and the power struggle is actually leading to polarization of this debate as well, right? So, no, thank you for that. And I'll go to Councillor Rice next.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. First question to Mr. Ali. Thank you for being here. So you mentioned about over 30% of police funding used to deal with social disorders. And so I just want clarification on, do you mean they're dealing with the safety concern caused by social disorder, or they're dealing with social disorder directly? Because this is two different things. So it's not clear, and for me, so I would like that clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't actually make that comment. I was just referencing what the police chief said. I believe he said, once again, he can correct me. He's not there anymore. What was it? I believe he said that police spend 30% of their time on what's called social issues. I believe that was the statement.
So it's my understanding, also it's what I heard and from my constituents in my ward, and then police is dealing the safety concerns caused by social disorder. They are not, of course, I totally believe, yes, they're not expert for the work. Our expertise and from social works and the mental health specialists doing, but they're dealing with the safety concern and caused by that. So I just want to clarify for that first question, and thank you. The second question is to Ms. Senha. And thank you for your great work and for anti-racism. And then I do want clarify two questions here. The first question about, I heard a few of you talk about, so you are one of them, so talking about our police funding still not reduced since past 5 years, they still received and 384.9. So by looking at the police funding since 2019 to 2022, for these 4 years, you can say the increase is only like less than 1%. Less than 1% from 2019 to 2022, and compared to our city's operating budget increase percentage, and compared to our city's, our country's inflation rate, and less than 1% from 356.3 to 384.9. And then I just want everybody and then to look at this number, and then if you could provide clarification on, do you mean they're not reduced, is only look at the number face value instead of looking at the actual value and for the money?
I'm so glad you asked this question because I think there is a lot of confusion, and I want to also raise, Councillor Tang was asking about earlier whether or not we should be using words like defund the police, etc. What I am saying is that the part that council has been dealing with has been in the realm of automatic and expected increases to the operational budget. And the public have the idea that the operational budget is being cut. And it was within the Safer for All report to create a freeze on the automatic increases. And it's so important that the public understand that. And I can understand.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My time is out. I think my question is misinterpreted. I will come to the second round. Thank you.
Third round. It will be third round, Councillor Rice. Councillor Jans, you're next.
Councillor Rutherford.
Sorry, I'm Councillor Rutherford. Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Ali, another thing that you kind of mentioned about, the need for social workers, and I think we're all in agreement. I think even the police force yesterday and the day before highlighted the need for more of those scaling up of like COT teams and help and those kind of things. But there is something in the report, and there's something that I think is really important. I'd like your thoughts on this. Is there is an authority that police officers have that other social workers or other even like peace officers don't have. So for example, PISECA is a good example, right? Where when we're talking about being able to, these are acts and legislation that only police have the authority over. So how do we rectify, okay, well, if we put social workers there, but they don't have the authority, are we setting them up to fail?
That is an excellent question. So what I would say, what I would argue here is that I think what's called that this is something that the province needs to look into. The province needs to review the Police Act and really make legislative changes. And I think City Council can be a pusher for that. And I would also say to your first point that while social workers do not have the same presence or authority that EPS officers do, I would also say that's kind of a good thing, because I think that actually helps a little bit, because once again, for a lot of folks, it's intimidating to talk to an officer. You know what I mean? Even for me, I'm very intimidated, and a lot of people are. So, and I'm fine talking to social workers because it's more of a personal connection, I think, and I think social workers are really able to facilitate that compared to police officers. So I think I would actually, while they don't technically have legal authority, I would say giving them legal authority and letting them continue with what they're doing would be a perfect suggestion, and I encourage the province to look into this.
Great. And then my next question, my last question for the speakers is to Ms. Hayrit-Sue. Is she there?
Yep. Hi, Councillor. Can you hear me?
Yep. You mentioned in one of your responses to another councillor that you feel that the police are under-resourced. So when you hear the amount, 407 million, is being given to the police, what do you consider to be an effective resource funding? And also, I know the Chamber's been very active on, making sure that our tax increases are minimized. So we heard that report about 8.5% without police funding included in that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for the question. I just want to make it a clarification that today I'm not here on behalf of the Edmonton Chamber. I am here just as a representative of the Downtown Recovery Coalition. So I do want to separate those two things.
Fair enough. Sorry about that.
It's okay. So when I hear the number, I mean, really, I'm looking at this from a business perspective downtown and from a vibrancy and citizen perspective. I think it's an overwhelming number to kind of delve into the numbers to, or delve into the details of. But I think what's really important for council to separate out is, are we providing EPS the right amount of support that they need with a force that's obviously also been hindered by COVID, and that's still coming back from that. And as the prosecution capital of the province as well, I think our numbers sometimes are a little bit inflated by the fact that, I mean, everyone who is being prosecuted is coming to Edmonton. So I think our budget isn't necessarily from a high level perspective. We can't say, are they under-resourced or not, just based on a number. We really have to, we're witnessing that they currently are right now in our core. And it's affecting people's ability to enjoy downtown. It's affecting businesses' ability to survive. And it's an issue that it's a really tricky problem and council needs to solve, but that's my view on the budget number.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rutherford. Councillor Jans?
Thank you. My question is for Ms. Sinha. I wanted to start a quote from Chief McPhee, actually, in July 7th, 2020. He said, "Our goal in policing should be to work our way out of a job." And I have to say, I agree. I think we all agree. I think we're all trying to get to an ecosystem where we need minimal police presence, where we're taking care of one another, and just as we need minimal oncologists or minimal paramedics or minimal firefighters. So I share that aspiration, and I think it was the Canadian Association of Police Chiefs who said 80% of current police work is not police work, it's other work. And I can't help but think that most of the calls I get in my ward, catalytic converter thefts, bike thefts, petty thefts, somebody rummaging around to take a Black & Decker drill, all of that little stuff that takes up time, talent, and we have highly trained police officers chasing after screwdrivers. And I can't help but everything, when I talk to neighbors, did you call the police? And they do, and I said, well, what did the police say? They said, well, they were responding to an overdose or opioids. And I can't help but feel we're looking at a problem here where the province has been hostile to safe consumption sites, hostile to harm reduction, hostile to safe supply and other measures that we're treating Edmonton like it's the 1920s and we have prohibition over alcohol. And I guess I just wanted to know, like, where's the Anti-Racism Advisory Committee, and where are you on this work? Because until we have meaningful public policy change, we'll never really have meaningful policing or public safety change.
And please try to answer that question within the time frame, which is 1 minute and 16 seconds now.
I will try. I appreciate that I speak at length, so apologies. To answer your question, where's the Anti-Racism Advisory Committee? I think at the moment we're a little bit, we're struggling to participate. I think we participated at such a rate with the anti-racism strategy. And so in that volunteer capacity, people are worn out. And I think while that was a tremendous win, we've experienced the lack of support since. You know, yeah, we've experienced also the systemic domination since. And so it's hard for us to participate. Usually there are a lot more people speaking at these meetings. And so I'm proud of myself from coming out anyway with those struggling experiences going on. But we're struggling. And at the moment, the city has put all of its anti-racism right there in that one place.
Okay, sounds like an area we need to look at then too. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor Jans. Councillor Principe?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Houle, I just wanted to, you and Councillor Tang were discussing the term defund the police. And, you know, that's all wording semantics. But would you agree that the EPS expected budget was decreased?
I believe that the formula was frozen. That did not stop them from getting increased funding.
So you're not aware that there were millions of dollars that were expected in the budget?
I'm aware that in 2019 they received 378 million. In 2020 they received 394. In 2021 they received 406, and in 2022 they are slated to receive 407. That doesn't sound like defunding to me. That sounds like ongoing escalating funding year after year.
Oh, okay. Because I actually can send it to you and show you the numbers, so that's no problem. So we can clear that up. Then I can send that to you and show you. And in my words, that is considered defunding the police. And then Ms. Haritsu, I just wanted to ask you a question. Did you get a chance to look at the report at the options that were shown to council?
I did, yeah.
Would you agree with the recommendation of administration of option 2? Or what is your?
Sorry, I'm just pulling up what specifically option 2. I have it on my screen here. Or
It would be a funding formula. kind of a revised version of the funding formula.
Yeah, I do think a revised version of the funding formula would work for EPS. But I also, I think this is a yes and situation. So I just argue that everyone here is bringing forward very valid concerns. And I think the council, needs to just weigh how they serve, the cautious Edmontonian, as Councillor Cartmel said yesterday, and coming downtown and coming to business districts all throughout the city and feeling safe to do so.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I agree. That's great. Okay. Thank you very much. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Councillor Principe. Councillor Wright.
Thank you very much. My question is for Ms. Haritsu. Again, I'm just wondering as noted in the report, it says that an appropriate amount of police funding is a complex exercise. And I'm just wondering from a business perspective, do you take into account in budgeting sort of population growth or accounting for inflation?
Like if I was personally managing a budget, would I take that into account? Yes.
Yes. Okay. And what sort of, I guess, calculations would you be looking at then?
Are you saying just in general related to a budget, or in relation to this police budget? Sorry, I'm not following.
Sorry, in relation to just a business budgeting, what would you be accounting for maybe for inflation, rate of inflation?
I mean, it's still a hard question to answer, but I think you have to make sure that your budgets is, for whatever it is serving the average Edmontonian. And so if inflation costs are going up, I mean, the budget has to be ample enough to support that.
Okay, and I think my rest of my questions will be for admin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I go to Councillor Rice, just a quick question to Alex Herriot on the. I know there are immediate needs in the downtown. I understand that. I hear that, and we're trying to figure that out. But we're also talking about long-term sustainability of city finances, police service, social services. And I want to pose you the same question I posed to the other speakers around what does that smooth transition or transition itself look like, where we are deeply depolarizing this debate, because I'm sensing that polarization here too, right? And that we are actually getting to a point where right people are responding to the right needs.
Right. Thank you for the question, and also thank you for the motion made yesterday. I do agree there's short-term urgent situations that we're facing, but long-term, I think your overall goal of getting out of the business, as Councillor John said, it should be the goal that council has. Unfortunately, though, I think cities across North America are facing really the recovery from COVID has been hard to manage, and I think while eventually we need to move away from huge police budgets, and hopefully we get there. I think right now where we're sitting as a city and the issues we're facing requires a thoughtful look at where that money is being spent. And so I think if you're looking 4 years down the road, absolutely, let's move to more of these social issues and addressing it in partnership with a bunch of different agencies that really serve the vast array of problems we're facing. But I think right now, if you're considering what's ahead of you, it is an urgent and a depleting force of COVID on the force. And so I think it's really important to weigh those two equally.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that, right? I'm looking not only for the next 4 years, but I'm also thinking like, why do I need to have a police officer respond if I'm in a collision? I want a police officer to show up if I'm in a life-death situation, right, where my physical safety is at risk, or there's gang violence out there. So I think just trying to understand that transition in cooperation with social agencies and the police service and our city. And I think even though the recommendation from the task force were leading into that direction, but I think that process also got politicized and polarized, unfortunately, right? So, And I'm really struggling with this in that sense. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for your participation. Appreciate that. We have a few more questions, and I'll go to Councillor Paquette first.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you everyone for coming today, and administration for the presentation. So maybe I'll start with Shalini, sorry. And so there's a few things that have been sort of going through my head over the past couple of years, and that is, and I'm just going to lay them out and then see how you respond. The assumptions on motivations, on no matter where someone is on in this conversation, there seems to be some assumptions on motivations, and those making assumptions usually assume motivations are negative, which I'm not sure they are. I'll let you address that, but I also am wondering about conflating timelines, because there are there's definitely work that has to be done. This has been sort of addressed where there's the long term, the short term, the medium term, and those seem to get kind of mixed up. So people get a little bit uncomfortable or don't feel safe when they don't see a logical process in how we are funding community safety and well-being overall, and what that means for police funding. And then the last thing is how we define roles about who should be where and why we're not having a larger conversation on those things. So I hope that is all there for you. And go ahead, because I know you give long answers, so I didn't want to break it up.
But I didn't quite understand the first question.
Okay, so the assumptions on motivations?
Yeah.
I'm just hearing a lot of talk that I would characterize as potentially populist when we're talking about funding or defunding or salaries, or just the whole gamut of the conversation can get mired into these sort of accusations and assumptions, and usually it's quite negative when really we should be having a conversation about data and about best practices and about reality.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the first thing that really it's the experience of the power imbalance. And so some voices and some perspectives dominate when we need to understand that we're equal partners. And so some people are fighting to have their voices heard, and they're underrepresented, and they're not here, and they don't have the resources, and they don't have the data because we haven't been looking for that data. And the people who have the, who can create data are creating it to achieve their own means. So again, going back to, we should not be in this power struggle over a common goal. And the power struggle is about who should have the money and do what. So I think that comes to your second piece, is that our messaging shouldn't be us against them. It should be, how are we working together and where are our roles? So for example, I think we need to understand that when police are extremely well trained and armed, that their role is in those emergency violence situations, and that other people need to carry the funding and the perspective and the resources for all the other areas of mental health, of trauma, of social, of all those other areas. I hope I captured all those three questions.
Yeah, well, I'm out of time, but thank you.
No, this is your first round, Constable Paquette, so you have another minute and a half. Okay,
great. Okay, so yeah, I hear what you're saying. My next question then is the conflating timelines. We've got short, medium, and long-term goals, and people are saying, well, the real conversation is how do we adequately fund all of the things that we need? I think that should be the primary conversation. And what is our timeline for getting to the outcomes that we want? And what is the appropriate funding to get to the outcomes we want? And I just don't feel like we're actually having that conversation in a way that promotes public comfort or security or trust in the process. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. And there's quite a number of factors. For example, when the policing budget wasn't increased recently, I understand that the police had already expected for that budget, and that was very difficult for them at that time. I also understand that it's hard to keep giving the public a message that we're going to keep doing the same thing. We have to do a different thing. So if we could agree that, see, anti-racism isn't actually in this report anywhere, the impact on anti-racism. And on that, I do want to say, if I have the opportunity, that there are no Indigenous speakers here, if I'm correct. No, I'm sorry, Robert is here, but there are few Indigenous speakers, and social workers are not always a safe point for Indigenous folks because of history. And so if that's our main direction, we need to rethink that. So how can we create a system where we're actually working together and not undermining each other to create immediate, medium, and long-term goals in a strategy? So I don't like hearing.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a second because I think that was wonderful, what you just said. How do we actually support each other, all of us, in getting to these goals? And I feel like there's, an undercurrent of non-support on all sides, which I hope is not true. But there is that feeling, and I would love to see a shift to where this conversation is actually more productive. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Paquette. Councillor Rice.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. And then the question to Ms. Sinha, and then to continue the last question. And I just want to ask you, and then how this link be drawn and between the lumber face value less than 1% increase from 2019 to 2022, and compared to our Edmonton's population increase percentage, and also compared to the inflation rate, and this morning I heard is up to 6.7% already. And how could that conclusion be drawn, and police funding is not reduced?
Yeah, I appreciate that. When I answered the question last time, it became clear that I didn't quite understand the question you're asking, and I'm not hearing it differently. So what I'm hearing is how you're asking me to explain how I see it, that funding hasn't been reduced. Is that correct?
Is not really. So in fact, because I only have like 3 minutes, so I just want to mindful to my time. And if this question I can answer to administration as well, and I can leave for that. I just want to say that link, how this link less than 1% and compared to inflation rate, and this so much high and be drought and then is not reduced. Yeah. So that's a question I could ask early to administration as well. So the next question, I really appreciate that you brought the relationship between anti-racism and EPS. Can you explain a little bit more, and for me to understand what's the really concern there? And then because, so EPS to address any or respond any public safety and regarding racism happened, how that link back from your understanding and from the chair of anti-racism committee, and then maybe can give me more information on that piece.
Okay, perfect. And in my presentation, when I said less than 1%, I wasn't talking about the funding budget. I was talking about the relationship between what's been put into anti-racism and the police budget at the moment. So a link between anti-racism and policing, for example, if we look at our prison system, which is an outcome of policing, then we see that far disproportionately there are Indigenous people and Black people in the prison system. And we see far disproportionately that Indigenous people and Black people are interacted with the police or engaged with the police. And so if we come from the belief that that is true in the case because Indigenous people and Black people function poorer in society, there's something wrong with them, they're extra violent, they're problematic, then we're not taking an anti-racist perspective.
Thank you.
An anti-racist perspective.
My time is out. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Rice. Next, Councillor Principe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to ask Mr. Houle, I just wanted to see if you had an opinion on which option. I'm not sure if I heard it about which option that was ideal for you that was given by administration, option 1, 2, or 3. Do you have a preferred option that you've seen?
I think the recommendation from the community, the Safe for All Task Force, was to freeze funding, so it would lean most closely to option number 3.
Option 1 or option 3? Option 3?
Option 3.
Option 3. Okay, thank you. And I just wanted to say that I'm not an expert on policing. I'm not an expert. I do not have that expertise. So I don't know exactly where all the money is going to, but I do know that they're held accountable for the money. And if they believe they need a plane, then I trust in them. I believe that that plane is not being used to go to the Bahamas, but rather to keep the residents of Edmonton safe. And that's why I think that we need to, like many people have said today, we need to come together and figure this out. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's it.
Thank you, Councillor Principe. Councillor Wright.
Thank you. I just a follow-up question for Ms. Haritsu. Just getting back to sort of the business side of things with the budgeting. So again, from a business perspective, would you track your budget on an ongoing basis to see whether or not you were sort of meeting expectations or had to make adjustments?
I would, from a budget perspective. I do believe that the commission does track the police's budget. And I think part of the reason that maybe the public might be less informed on it is just, I don't know that the commission, communicates regularly with the opportunities to engage with itself. I think if that's an area of under education for the general citizen, I think upping their communications activities would be useful.
Yeah, and I'm just sort of seeing that here now too, where we're talking about, did they get an increase? Did they not get an increase? What's, expected funding? And again, from a business perspective, when revenues drop, do you need to make adjustments to your budget?
You do, but in this scenario, it depends on demand. So if I'm looking at it from a standpoint of serving members, hypothetically, if I'm looking at it from a chamber perspective, if the demand from our members is still there, we have to find a way of ensuring we meet that. So while revenue might be dropping, you do need to still find a way to serve properly. And I think, if you're in control of the budget, you also need to look at how you're allocating it to make sure that the most urgent areas are supported quickly.
Okay, so responsible management, I guess, of those dollars, and I think you've talked about sort of transparency and reporting information. Yeah, and I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wright. So that concludes questions to the public, and we'll go to our administration next, and part of the administration is the delegation from Edmonton Police Commission. And I think this will be an opportunity for commission members as well, if they want to respond to some of the if they have any responses to, if they heard any concerns that they would like to respond to from the public members. Maybe the council members ask those questions to them, right? We'll see how that goes. So we'll just let people settle. Mike. Turn the mic off. Oh, wasn't? Okay. Okay, good. I was able to hear you. Okay. All right. Okay, we're ready to go? All right, Councillor Stevenson, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate the report. I thought there was a lot of clarity and definitely provided some good background and good information. I just want to dig into something right off the bat. So we will have multiple rounds on this, no doubt, but wanted to set the stage a little bit, touching on, we talked a little bit about some of the language used, but also, I was interested in the report when the assessment of a service package approach was provided. It was noted that previous budget processes had been very time-consuming and challenging. I'm wondering if administration could maybe just elaborate a little bit more about what made those conversations so challenging.
Yeah, Councillor, I mean, I think first of all, there was a lot more of them. And in that kind of a model, essentially, I think council at the time, and again, I wasn't present at the time, so, but what I understand is that there were a lot more of those conversations, that police commission would come to council more often, and there was an unpredictability of it that became a challenge. So when I look at it from purely administrator perspective, I very much, like set the parameters in a 4-year budget and then go, as opposed to coming back and forth. And it is difficult. I think everybody acknowledges it's difficult when you don't know what your budget will be next year. So those are some of the challenges. I don't know if Ms. Padbury wants to comment from a financial services perspective.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is, so each of the service packages would be debated, but ultimately would form that envelope of funding, and then it still ultimately ultimately the purview of the commission to do the allocation.
Yeah, when I think I've heard from folks who served on earlier councils or earlier on other councils as well, just that part of it was also very difficult in terms of the asks that were being made and how those asks were being framed. And some of the politics around that. Just wondering if that's something you could speak to.
Well, I don't think I'll speak to the politics, but clearly, the more often it's debated in council, the more you're going to have speakers arrive and show up and discuss, and you're going to have the polarizing views that we often hear when this debate happens. So I would say that if you choose to go that model, the expectation should be more political discussions in chambers about police funding.
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe something to circle back on later, but I did also want to maybe address something that I maybe heard about yesterday, and I think is a challenge, is that I think there's two different ways that we talk about efficiencies in our organizations. And I think one way that we talk about efficiencies is doing more with less. So as an administration, I think when you're looking for efficiencies, that's typically about returning or not collecting additional tax dollars. So actually looking to shrink the pie and continue feeding the same number of people, let's say. Whereas I think maybe, and happy for the service to respond as well, that another way of looking at efficiency is about keeping the pie the same size, but just allocating it to more urgent needs. Is that a fair characteristic?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I agree with the second description. I do not agree with the concept of more with less. I've heard that for 30 years as a person working at federal, provincial, and municipal government now, and it doesn't work. I will say we can do less with less, and we can always be more efficient, and we've got to prioritize what we're doing if the envelope shrinks, and if resources are smaller, that's fine. We just prioritize. So I don't use that term, and I don't think it's supported either by council. Like, I think council understands that. So I think you're right. We have to pick our priorities.
Right.
And
so then maybe just to the service, because I do know the work that you've done in terms of resource efficiency, absolutely. And I think maybe there's just a disconnect when we hear the conversation about about efficiency, but we're not actually seeing a decrease in the budget. So just wondering if you could maybe speak to that a bit more.
Well, I think that speaks to the whole premise of community safety and well-being and why we've seen 3 years of crime stats go down by the actions that we took, moving $38 million and finding the right partnerships. To the city manager's point, there's enough money in the system, but I think it's clear when you actually look at the system. I know there's a lot of stats being thrown around, some of which I'd like to address later. But if you look at the police budget and you look at the overall pie of the city, taken in consideration as it was articulated by the finance minister or finance director, is there's a lot of things changing in the city. The city's growing. There's different challenges in the city, and police went from a 12.7% of the pie to 11 point some over the last few years. So I think when you're talking about consistency, you also obviously have to take those things into consideration, and that's something that the funding formula has done in the past and something that we take. And then with that, we have to deploy differently. And unlike what's been heard here today, we measure just about everything, as you know from your time on the commission. And we do have a lot of these results. The stats that I'm hearing are cherry-picked, and quite frankly, I don't think they reflect exactly what we're doing. So I think it is about being more efficient all the time. And that's how you end up bend at the cost curve. That's how you take people out of the system. It's not always about getting to the first call. It's about how do you stop the second, the third, the fifth, the 20th, and the 50th call, and that's where your partners come in.
Thank you, Chief. I'm going to stop you here, maybe for the next round, right? So, because we have a dead stop at 12 o'clock. Councillor Rutherford?
Yep, okay, well, I think I would like to put a motion on the floor, if that's okay. Just get it on there right now, before lunch. Is that okay? I know that's kind of the practice we've been having right now, is to try to get the motion on.
At the committee, I think if we could go through first round of questions, maybe then, because I don't want people's ability to be constrained by a motion, right? So I would suggest that we go through one round of questions.
Because how we've done it in the past, though, Mr. Chair, is
at committee, I think we have allowed questions.
we've allowed questions even after the motion's on the floor.
Yeah, we have that too, right?
Yeah.
But I just not worry, but I would have concern then the framing of the question may revolve around the motion, right? So, yeah.
I think we have two big decisions before us today, so my motion that I would like to propose putting on the floor addresses the first one, because we have two big decisions. We have the base budget decision, and then we have the how are we going to fund the police going forward. Yeah. And so if we don't start to get those motions on the floor.
Get a sense from the committee then, if committee is okay with having a motion on the floor. Okay. Councillor.
Point of order.
Councillor Rice, yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of the two decision, actually is one, and because the first base budget is in the formula, and then is not separate.
We have two decisions to make: base budget and the formula.
But the base budget is in the formula.
No,
is a part of the formula. Is not separate.
But we're not giving.
It's not part of the formula.
It's not guaranteed.
If you look at the formula here, and it's said very clear that it's part of the formula.
Sorry, point of order. This is my time.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind, Councillor. No, maybe I'll seek administration. Can you clarify what points? Two points. Two decisions we need to make today.
So the only decision, well, I don't think you actually need to make any decision today. That's your choice if you choose to make a decision.
Yeah.
This report is solely focused on the mechanism for funding. Is it old budget process, a formula, or a freeze?
Okay, but to have that discussion, you say in the report that we need to have, that you were not going to make a recommendation, but council needed to decide on the base budget.
Yes, you will need to decide on the base budget for EPS. Whether you do that today or not, I think you have some time to decide on that.
Yeah. So I as a chair, I would suggest that we go through questions, and at that time get a sense, and then we can consider motions. So that'll be my decision as the chair, because I don't want
Can you make that, point of order, but can you make that decision, or don't I have the right to put a motion on the floor? So I would like to.
I would suggest that we do take that process, but
Okay, I will respect that, but know that I will be making a motion then on the second round, and I hope that no other counselors, in the meantime, put another motion
no,
on
I
the
will,
floor.
I would, if I would
in
rule
lieu
that
of
as well,
this-
because
this
that's,
conceding.
I would hope others respect that too. And I'll come to you right after we done round one to have that motion on the floor. Okay, we'll take a break now, and we'll come back at 1:30. I'll be a little late, Councillor Stevenson, if you don't mind taking the chair at that time, 1:30.
Yes, and am I correct that we'll be doing 6.3 as first order of business at 1:30? Okay.
That is correct.
So we won't be on this item right away after lunch?
Yeah, thank you.